The lone hunter saves a widow and her children from a tribal ambush, and they discover strength in unity. Welcome to today's story, set in the rugged American frontier of 1872. You're about to witness an incredible tale of survival, courage, and unexpected bonds formed in the harsh wilderness of Wyoming Territory. A lone hunter's path crosses with a desperate family fleeing danger, and together they'll discover that sometimes the greatest strength comes from the most unlikely alliances. Before we begin, if you enjoy this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Wyoming Territory like a shroud, broken only by the distant crack of rifle fire that echoed across the valley. Marcus Thorne pulled his weathered hat lower over his steel-gray eyes, his calloused hands tightening on the reins of his sturdy Mustang. At 42, he had spent the better part of 2 decades tracking game and outlaws across this unforgiving landscape, his face bearing the deep lines carved by sun, wind, and solitude. The gunfire came again. 3 sharp reports, followed by women's screams. Marcus urged his horse forward through the pine grove, his Henry rifle sliding smoothly from its scabbard. 20 years of frontier life had taught him that in this territory, the difference between life and death often came down to seconds and the willingness to act without hesitation. As he crested a small ridge, the scene below made his jaw clench. A covered wagon sat tilted at an awkward angle, its left rear wheel shattered, while a small band of Lakota warriors circled on horseback. Near the wagon, a woman with auburn hair knelt protectively over 2 children, a boy of perhaps 10 and a girl no older than 7, while clutching a smoking shotgun with trembling hands. Margaret O'Brien had never imagined her journey west would end like this. 3 months ago, she'd been the wife of a successful merchant in St. Louis, planning their family's move to the Oregon Territory, where her late husband Patrick had purchased land. Now, widowed by a fever that had taken him just weeks before their departure, she found herself alone with young Thomas and little Catherine, determined to honor Patrick's dream despite her overwhelming fear. The Lakota warriors, their faces painted for war, had appeared from nowhere as her wagon struggled up the rocky trail. Her elderly guide, Old Pete, lay motionless 20 yards away, an arrow protruding from his chest. Margaret had managed one desperate shot with Pete's shotgun, sending the warriors briefly retreating, but she knew it was only a matter of moments before they would close in again. Marcus studied the situation with the calculating eye of a man who had survived countless dangerous encounters. 6 warriors, well armed and mounted, against 1 woman and 2 terrified children. The odds were impossible, but something in the woman's fierce protection of her young ones reminded him of his own mother, who had died defending their homestead when he was barely older than the boy below. Without announcing his presence, Marcus raised his rifle and took careful aim at the warrior leader, a tall man with distinctive white paint across his forehead. The shot rang out across the valley, and the warrior tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. The remaining 5 warriors wheeled around in confusion, searching for the source of the attack. "Stay down," Marcus shouted to the family as he spurred his horse down the slope, working the lever action of his Henry rifle with practiced efficiency. 2 more shots echoed through the morning air, and another warrior fell from his mount, this one clutching his thigh. The attack had turned the tide. The remaining warriors, faced with an unknown number of hidden attackers, gathered their wounded and retreated into the tree line, their war cries fading into the distance. Marcus knew they would regroup and return, probably with reinforcements. This skirmish had bought time, nothing more. Margaret watched in amazement as the lone rider approached, his rifle still ready, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. There was something both reassuring and intimidating about this stranger. The easy confidence with which he handled his weapon, the way his gaze missed nothing, the quiet authority in his movements. "Ma'am," Marcus said, touching the brim of his hat as he dismounted. "Name's Marcus Thorne. Are you or the children hurt?" "No, we're unharmed," Margaret managed, her voice shaking with residual fear and relief. "I'm Margaret O'Brien, and these are my children, Thomas and Catherine. Our guide." She gestured helplessly toward old Pete's still form. Marcus knelt beside the old man, checking for signs of life before gently closing Pete's eyes. "I knew Pete Morrison for 15 years. He was a good man." He stood, already moving toward the damaged wagon. "We need to move quickly. They'll be back with more warriors before sunset." Broom. As Marcus examined the broken wheel, Thomas stepped forward, his young face trying to mask his fear with the bravado of someone forced to grow up too quickly. "Are you going to help us, mister?" Marcus looked at the boy, really looked at him, seeing the attempt at courage, the protective stance in front of his sister, the way his small hands clenched into fists. "Yes, son, but we're going to have to work together if we want to see tomorrow." If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me continue creating content like this. The damaged wagon wheel was beyond repair, but Marcus's experienced eye quickly assessed their options. His own pack horse could carry essential supplies, and with careful rationing, they could make it to Fort Bridger on foot if they could stay ahead of their pursuers. "Mrs. O'Brien," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm, "we need to take only what's absolutely necessary. Food, water, warm clothes and ammunition. Everything else stays behind." Margaret nodded, her practical nature overriding the sentimental attachment to the few precious belongings she had brought from her old life. Together they quickly sorted through the wagon's contents while Marcus kept watch. A daguerreotype of Patrick, her mother's Bible, Thomas's wooden toy soldiers, and Catherine's cherished ragdoll were tucked into the most essential bundle along with supplies. As they prepared to leave, Catherine tugged at Marcus's coat with small, dirt-smudged fingers. "Mister, are the bad men going to come back?" Marcus knelt to her level, his weathered face softening. "They might, little one, but I promise you this. As long as I'm breathing, nothing's going to happen to you or your family." The weight of that promise settled on his shoulders as they began their trek into the wilderness, old Pete's body covered with a blanket and left beside the broken wagon. Behind them, smoke signals began rising from distant hills, and Marcus knew their real test was just beginning. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small group as they made their way along a deer trail that wound through dense pine forest and rocky outcroppings. Marcus led the way, his eyes constantly scanning for signs of pursuit while simultaneously searching for defensible positions and water sources. Behind him, Margaret struggled to keep pace while carrying little Catherine, who had grown too tired to walk. Thomas, determined to prove himself useful, carried a pack nearly as large as himself without complaint. They had been walking for 3 hours when Marcus raised his hand, signaling for silence. In the distance, the sound of unshod horses on stone echoed through the trees. The Lakota had found their trail. "How many?" Margaret whispered, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. Marcus listened intently, his head tilted slightly. "At least 8, maybe more. They're moving fast." He looked around quickly, spotting a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards up the slope. "We need higher ground." The climb was treacherous, with loose shale that threatened to send them tumbling with every step. Catherine whimpered softly as Margaret struggled to carry her, and Marcus could see that the woman was reaching the limits of her endurance. Without a word, he scooped Catherine into his arms, her small hands clutching his shirt as he continued the ascent with sure-footed determination. "I can walk," Catherine whispered, though her exhaustion was evident. "I know you can, brave girl," Marcus replied softly, "but right now, I need you to be my lookout. Can you watch behind us and tell me if you see anything moving?" The simple task gave Catherine a sense of purpose, and her fearful whimpering ceased as she took her new responsibility seriously. Thomas, observing this interaction, felt a grudging respect for the stranger who seemed to understand children better than most adults. They reached the boulder formation just as the sound of horses grew distinctly closer. Marcus quickly positioned the family behind the largest rock, creating a natural fortress with good sightlines and multiple escape routes. From his saddlebags, he produced extra ammunition and a second revolver, which he handed to Margaret. "Do you know how to use this?" he asked. Margaret's hands shook as she accepted the weapon. "Patrick taught me to shoot bottles behind our house, but I've never—" "You won't have to, unless they get past me," Marcus assured her. "But if it comes to that, aim for the largest part of their body and keep pulling the trigger until it stops clicking." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and through the trees below they could see flashes of movement. The war party had grown. Marcus counted at least 10 warriors, their horses picking their way carefully along the trail the fugitives had left. Thomas crawled up beside Marcus, his young face set with determination. "Let me help. I can load your rifle while you shoot." Marcus studied the boy for a moment, seeing something of his younger self in those steady eyes. "Can you count to 16? "Yes, sir." "Then you count my shots. When I reach 16, you hand me this." He showed Thomas how to work the loading mechanism on his spare rifle. "Can you do that?" Thomas nodded solemnly, understanding that he was being trusted with something vitally important. The responsibility seemed to steady him, and his hands stopped shaking as he took hold of the second rifle. "Leave your comment about what you think of this story so far." The first warrior appeared on the trail below, moving cautiously as he followed their tracks. Marcus waited, controlling his breathing until 3 more riders came into view. At this range, with good cover and clear sightlines, he held every advantage except numbers. His first shot took the lead scout from his horse, the crack of the Henry rifle echoing through the forest like thunder. The remaining warriors immediately scattered, seeking cover among the trees, but Marcus had anticipated this. His second and third shots found their marks before the riders could fully take cover. The return fire came quickly, arrows whistling through the air and rifle shots from captured cavalry weapons. One arrow embedded itself in the rock inches from Catherine's head, causing her to cry out in terror. Margaret pulled both children deeper into the shelter of the boulders, while Marcus continued his methodical shooting. 8, Thomas counted quietly, his hands steady as he prepared the second rifle. Below them, the warriors had regrouped and were attempting to work their way up the slope, using the cover of trees and rocks. Marcus could see their strategy. They would try to flank his position while keeping him pinned down with covering fire. It was a sound tactic, and with enough men, it would eventually succeed. 12, Thomas whispered. A warrior had managed to work his way to within 30 yards of their position, hidden behind a lightning-struck pine. Marcus could see just the edge of the man's moccasin, but it was enough. His 13th shot splintered bark and sent the warrior tumbling down the slope. 14, 15! The attack suddenly intensified, with arrows and bullets striking their rocky shelter from multiple directions. The warriors were coordinating their assault, trying to overwhelm his position through sheer volume of fire. Marcus took his 16th shot, then smoothly accepted the loaded rifle from Thomas. "Good work, son," he said, never taking his eyes off the slope below. But even as he continued firing, Marcus knew their situation was deteriorating. The warriors had established positions that would allow them to maintain pressure, while some of their number worked around to attack from the rear. He had perhaps an hour before their position became untenable. That's when he noticed something that changed everything. On the horizon, visible through a gap in the trees, a thin column of smoke rose straight into the still air. It was too distant to be another war party, and the smoke was too regular, too controlled. Someone was maintaining a steady fire, the kind used for cooking or warmth. "Mrs. O'Brien," Marcus called back without turning around. "How far were you from Fort Bridger when the attack happened?" "Pete said we were about a day's hard ride," Margaret replied, keeping her voice steady despite the bullets whining overhead. Marcus did quick calculations in his head. If that smoke was coming from the fort, and if someone there had heard the gunfire, it was a long shot, but it was their only chance. Taking careful aim, Marcus began firing in a specific pattern. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, pause, 3 shots. It was an old frontier signal, a call for help that any experienced frontiersman would recognize. He repeated the pattern twice, using precious ammunition but hoping someone at the fort would understand. The warriors below seemed to sense that something had changed. Their attack became more aggressive, more desperate. Marcus realized that they too had seen the smoke and understood what it might mean. This was no longer a leisurely hunt. It was a race against time. The sun had moved noticeably across the sky when the character of the battle changed. The Lakota warriors, realizing that their quarry might have signaled for help, abandoned their cautious approach and launched a direct assault on the rocky outcropping. Marcus found himself facing the most intense fighting of his life as painted figures darted between trees and rocks, working their way steadily closer to the family's position. "Thomas, get your mother and sister ready to move," Marcus commanded, never taking his eyes off the approaching warriors. "We're going to have to make a run for it." "Where?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with controlled panic as bullets chipped rock fragments around them. Marcus pointed toward a narrow ravine that cut through the forest about 200 yards to their east. "There's water down there and better cover. If help is coming from the fort, that's where they'll find us." The plan was desperate. They would have to break cover and run across open ground while under fire from multiple positions. But staying put meant certain death or capture, and Marcus had seen what happened to captives taken by war parties seeking revenge. He waited for a lull in the firing, then made his decision. Rising suddenly from behind the rocks, Marcus laid down rapid covering fire, his rifle cracking repeatedly as he targeted every muzzle flash and moving shadow he could see. "Go, now!" Margaret grabbed Catherine's hand, while Thomas shouldered their remaining supplies. Together they sprinted down the slope toward the ravine, slipping and sliding on loose shale, while bullets whistled around them. Marcus continued firing, working the lever action of his Henry rifle with mechanical precision. Each shot calculated to keep the warriors' heads down for just a few more precious seconds. A war cry echoed from their left flank. A warrior had worked his way around their position and was now charging directly at the fleeing family. Thomas saw him first, a painted figure on foot carrying a tomahawk, less than 50 yards away and closing fast. Without thinking, the boy grabbed a fallen branch and hurled it at the warrior's legs, causing him to stumble just as Marcus's rifle cracked from behind them. If you're enjoying this intense chapter, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible frontier stories. They reached the ravine just as the main body of warriors crested the rocky outcropping they had abandoned. The narrow cut in the earth was deeper than it had appeared from above, nearly 15 feet deep, with steep sides that would provide excellent protection. A small stream ran along the bottom, providing the water they desperately needed. Marcus slid down the bank last, just as arrows began arcing down into the ravine. One grazed his shoulder, tearing through his shirt and leaving a burning line across his skin, but he ignored the wound as he helped position the family behind a curve in the ravine wall that would protect them from direct fire. "Are you hurt?" Margaret asked, noticing the blood on his shirt. "Just a scratch," Marcus replied, though the wound burned like fire. He checked his ammunition. 14 rounds left for the rifle and a dozen for his revolver, not nearly enough for a prolonged fight. Above them, the warriors were spreading out along the rim of the ravine, looking for positions that would allow them to fire down at their trapped quarry. It was a siege now, and Marcus knew that without reinforcement, they could only hold out for so long. That's when they heard it, a sound that made Marcus's heart leap with hope. In the distance, growing steadily louder, came the thunder of approaching horses. Many horses moving fast and in formation. The cavalry patrol from Fort Bridger had heard his signal and was coming at full gallop. The Lakota warriors heard it too. Their war cries took on a different tone, no longer the confident calls of hunters closing in on prey, but the urgent signals of fighters who suddenly found themselves caught between enemies. From his position at the bottom of the ravine, Marcus could hear shouted orders in the Lakota language, followed by the sound of horses departing at speed. But not all of them left. 3 warriors, either too committed to the fight or too proud to retreat, remained at the edge of the ravine. One of them called out in heavily accented English, "White man, you have killed my brother. I will not leave without your scalp." Marcus recognized the voice. It was the war party leader he had wounded in the first attack, the man with white paint across his forehead. He had returned, and now this was personal. "Stay down," Marcus whispered to the family as he moved to get a better angle. "No matter what happens, stay down until the cavalry gets here." The next few minutes stretched like hours. Marcus engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with the 3 remaining warriors, each side trying to get a clear shot while avoiding the increasingly loud sound of approaching cavalry. Arrows and bullets ricocheted off rock walls, while Catherine clung to her mother and Thomas crouched nearby, clutching his small knife and watching Marcus with the intense focus of someone learning how to be a man in the most dangerous circumstances possible. The cavalry arrived like a thunderclap, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard earth as they swept through the forest. Lieutenant James Anderson, a 28-year-old West Point graduate on his first frontier posting, led 12 seasoned troopers in a charge that scattered the remaining Lakota warriors like leaves before a storm. "This is the U.S. Army," Anderson shouted. "Throw down your weapons." The warrior leader, faced with impossible odds, made his choice. Rather than surrender or flee, he leaped down into the ravine, his tomahawk raised as he charged directly at Marcus. It was a warrior's death he sought, and Marcus respected that even as he raised his rifle. The shot echoed off the ravine walls, and the warrior fell just feet from where Marcus stood. A silence settled over the scene, broken only by the sound of cavalry horses above. Marcus felt the weight of exhaustion and relief wash over him simultaneously. "Hello down there," Lieutenant Anderson called from the rim. "Are you folks all right?" "We're alive," Marcus called back. "1 wounded, 3 civilians safe." As rope ladders were lowered into the ravine, Margaret looked at Marcus with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved our lives." Marcus helped Catherine climb onto the first ladder, his weathered hands gentle with the frightened child. "Ma'am, sometimes we all need saving. The trick is knowing when to accept help, when it's offered." Thomas was the last to climb out before Marcus, and as they reached the top, the boy turned to the man who had become his unlikely protector. "Mr. Thorne, what happens now?" Marcus looked out across the vast frontier landscape, then back at this brave family who had lost everything but still had each other. "Now, son, we figure out what comes next. Together." Fort Bridger buzzed with activity as the small rescue party returned with their survivors. The fort, established as a trading post by famous mountain man Jim Bridger, had grown into a crucial way station for emigrants heading west and a military outpost protecting the overland trails. News of the attack had spread quickly, and Margaret found herself surrounded by concerned women offering food, clean clothes, and comfort for her children. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the fort's medical officer, tended to Marcus's arrow wound in the infirmary, while Margaret sat nearby with Thomas and Catherine. The children had barely left her side since the rescue, the trauma of their ordeal evident in their reluctant sleep and frequent nightmares. "You're lucky," Dr. Hayes commented as he cleaned the wound. "Few inches lower, and that arrow would have found something vital. As it stands, you'll have a scar to add to your collection, but nothing worse." Marcus flexed his shoulder, testing the movement. "Doc, I've had worse from shaving. What about the family?" "Physically, they're unharmed. But trauma like this, especially for children, it takes time to heal." The doctor's expression grew serious. "That woman has shown remarkable strength, losing her husband, making the journey alone, then surviving what they've been through. But she's going to need support." Through the infirmary window, Marcus could see Margaret in the fort's common area, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Patterson, the commanding officer's wife, while Thomas and Catherine stayed close by her side. There was something about her quiet determination that reminded him of the pioneer women who had built this country. Strong, resilient, unwilling to give up, despite overwhelming odds. Colonel Robert Hayes, the fort's commanding officer, and Dr. Nye, Hayes's older brother, entered the infirmary with a grim expression. "Mr. Thorne, I need to speak with you about what happened out there." Marcus sat up straighter, wincing slightly at the movement. "Yes, sir? That war party you encountered, it wasn't random. Our scouts report that there's been increased activity along the Overland Trail. Small groups of young warriors breaking away from the main tribes, looking to make names for themselves by attacking settlers." The colonel's weathered face showed his concern. "This family was just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." "What's being done about it?" Marcus asked. "Increased patrols, better communication between forts, but the territory is vast and we can't be everywhere." Colonel Hayes looked out the window toward Margaret and her children. "Mrs. O'Brien tells me they were headed for Oregon Territory. Her late husband bought land there." Marcus nodded. "That's what she said. She's determined to honor his dream." "Alone? With 2 young children?" The colonel shook his head. "Mr. Thorne, I've seen a lot of brave folks attempt the impossible out here. Most of them end up in graves marked with nothing but stones." That evening, as the fort settled into its nightly routine, Marcus found himself walking the perimeter, unable to shake the feeling that his involvement with this family was far from over. The attack had changed something in him. Seeing their courage, their determination to stick together despite everything they'd faced, had awakened feelings he'd thought buried years ago. He found Margaret standing on the fort's observation platform, looking west toward the mountains that stood between them and Oregon Territory. The children were finally asleep in the quarters they'd been provided, watched over by Mrs. Patterson. "Hard to believe it's only been 2 days, Margaret said without turning around. "Feels like a lifetime." Marcus joined her at the railing, following her gaze toward the distant peaks. "You're thinking about the road ahead." "I don't know if I can do it alone," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Out there today when those warriors attacked, I was so frightened. Not for myself, but for Thomas and Catherine." "What if next time there's no one to help us?" "There's no shame in being frightened," Marcus said. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. You've got more courage than most men I know." Margaret turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time since their ordeal began. In the lantern light, she could see the lines around his eyes, the scars that spoke of a hard life lived on the frontier, but also something else. A gentleness that hadn't been hardened away by years of solitude. "Why did you help us?" she asked. "You could have ridden away. Most men would have." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. 23 years ago, my mother died defending our homestead while my father was away trading. I was hiding in the root cellar, too young and too scared to help her." He paused, the old pain still evident in his voice. "I swore that day that I'd never let fear stop me from helping someone who needed it. If this story is touching your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to see more incredible tales of courage and family." "What happened to you after that?" "Relatives took me in for a while, but I was too angry, too wild. Started making my own way when I was 15. Been alone ever since." Marcus turned to face her. "Until today, I thought that's how I wanted it." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a warming that had nothing to do with the mild evening air. "Mr. Thorne." "Marcus," he corrected gently. "Marcus," she repeated. "What are you saying?" Before he could answer, Thomas appeared at the top of the platform stairs, his hair tousled from sleep and his eyes wide with worry. "Ma, I had another bad dream. Are the warriors coming back?" Margaret immediately went to him, kneeling to his level and pulling him into a comforting embrace. "No, sweetheart, we're safe here. Mr. Thorne and the soldiers made sure of that." Thomas looked over his mother's shoulder at Marcus, and something passed between them, an understanding, a connection forged in shared danger and mutual respect. "Mr. Thorne," Thomas said, his young voice serious, "are you going to help us get to Oregon?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt the weight of 3 futures resting on his answer. He had spent decades avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, this kind of emotional attachment. But looking at this brave boy, this determined woman, and thinking of little Catherine asleep below, he realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. "Son," Marcus said, meeting Thomas's steady gaze, "if your mother will have me, I'll see you safely to Oregon Territory. You have my word." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Not of sorrow this time, but of relief and something deeper, something that felt like hope. "Marcus, we would be honored to have your protection, but I want you to know this isn't charity we're asking for. When we reach Oregon, that land Patrick bought, it's big enough for a partnership. If you wanted to stay, to help us build something." Marcus felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine smile he'd worn in years. "Ma'am, I believe that sounds like the kind of offer a man would be foolish to refuse." 3 weeks later, a small wagon train departed Fort Bridger, bound for Oregon Territory. It wasn't much. Just one family, one former lone hunter, 2 spare horses, and a wagon loaded with dreams and determination. But as they rolled out into the vast frontier landscape, with Thomas riding proudly beside Marcus and Catherine, singing softly in the wagon while Margaret handled the reins with new confidence, they carried something precious: the knowledge that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with elaborate plans, but with the simple decision to face the unknown together. Behind them, the fort gradually disappeared into the morning haze. Ahead lay challenges they couldn't yet imagine, but also the promise of new beginnings built on the foundation of courage, trust, and the kind of family bonds that aren't limited by blood, but forged in the fires of shared trials. As Marcus rode alongside his new family, he realized that his days as a lone hunter were over. He had found something worth protecting, worth building, worth fighting for. And for the first time in over 20 years, he was no longer alone. If you enjoyed this incredible tale of survival, courage, and family bonds forged on the American frontier, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and connecting with viewers who appreciate these powerful human stories. What was your favorite moment from this story? Was it Marcus's brave rescue, the family's determination to survive, or perhaps the beautiful way they found strength in their unity? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one and love discussing these stories with you. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you won't miss future stories of courage, adventure, and the incredible human spirit that built America. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Old West.